It's very interesting being in the House of Lords, because now that I've been here a while, I can see what it's like that a law that I opposed a lot is actually enacted. And the one that I'm thinking of was enacted starting yesterday, and that was the law on individual protests and noisy protests, when the police used the full might of the state to swoop down on Steve Bray and his massive sound system, and take the sound system away and threaten him and all the rest of it. Now, for those who don't know, Steve Bray is a very annoying gentleman. He wears a big EU hat, and every Wednesday, without fail, and sometimes more frequently, he and his merry band stand on the corner of Westminster and play very loud music, and also shout through a very loud megaphone. And when I walk past, they shout at me, and it's really embarrassing. Like, Claire Fox, Tory enabler, you are part of the fascist, oh God, and so on and so forth. So I can't tell you how much he annoys me. He's also, followed me walking up and down the street in Westminster and filmed me. The guy is a nuisance. That is the truth of the matter. And so in some ways, you could say that I'd be delighted that the police would shut him up. He's certainly anti-democratic, because he is using all of his noise to argue to overthrow the referendum result from 2016. And he is undoubtedly somebody who is almost like a professional irritant. But I still defend his right to make his noise. And in a democracy, you even have to defend the anti-democrats' right to protest. And so actually it was quite distressing to me that he was treated in the way that he was by the police. Somebody made a joke which I thought worked rather well, which said, if you're a woman walking home on your own and you're fearful that you're being attacked, get out a megaphone and you'll have 8 coppers there in 5 seconds, which is obviously showing what a waste of police resources. Absolutely ludicrous. He's certainly no threat. It's his words that might be offensive, but which are no danger to anybody. And so, it's suddenly, I thought I was part of the legislature, I can't even say it, House of Lords, that brought that bill through, even though I voted against it, and so on and so forth. On a more positive note about, I suppose, the way that the Lords can work and the making of law can work, a group of us who have become increasingly exasperated with the schools bill, which is almost written and designed by the Blob, which the Conservative Party claimed that they were getting rid of, but is a bureaucratic nightmare, centralising a power grab in relation to schools, and will cause a huge amount of damage also for homeschoolers, let alone anything else. But some of us saw the opportunity of a schools bill in the House of Lords to put in an amendment on the issue of whether parents should have the right to see material that's being taught in schools. This in particular related to the relationship and sex education materials, which are causing some concern about young kids being introduced to gender ideology, and these being provided by third parties, and also the introduction of critical race theory and notions of white supremacy and that all white people are inherently racist and so on, that were being introduced under the auspices of some kind of citizenship and introduction to anti-racism in schools. And the schools won't let parents see those. I've mentioned this before. Anyway, Estelle Morris, a former education secretary from Labour, put in that amendment, supported across the House. I spoke on it. My little film actually went a bit viral, got over 100,000 views on Twitter. Subsequently, the Department for Education have said, there's a real problem here that parents aren't able to see the material that's being used to teach their kids. It's had massive media coverage, and I did think, well, I suppose if you can only do that kind of thing, which is to raise issues in the public square and get some attention, allow parents to feel that their concerns, which they've been really worried about, lots of parents on this, but nobody was listening, to give it a wider platform, then that makes me feel that slightly cancels out some of the more negative things. Back to the negatives though. There is, at the moment, the Academic Freedom Bill is passing through the Lords. It's been through the House of Commons. It's the Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill brought forward by the Conservative government. I've said all along that I have qualms, and I said in my speech second reading that I really wish we didn't need a law to enforce academic freedom. It should be intrinsic to universities. I've still got those qualms, and I think there are real problems with the bill that I will be trying to amend, to remind you that second reading is where you can make sort of fairly general speeches, and when you get to committee stage, which is the next stage, you start putting in probing amendments. So I will be putting in lots of those. But in that second reading period, which was a few hours the other day, 5-6 hours worth of discussion, I thought that the House of Lords would be broadly split 50-50 about whether they supported the bill, and I was sadly disappointed that the vast majority of people who spoke were opposing the bill. And of those who were opposing, the vast majority used some really dangerous arguments. They largely were saying that there's nothing to see here, that there is no problem of free speech on campus. Students have always no platform people, what are you complaining about? But worse than that was this idea that this was a right-wing, alt-right, Trumpian attempt by the Conservative Party to whip up the culture wars, and therefore we should absolutely oppose the bill. The interesting thing about it was that a lot of the people who spoke kept saying, I'm the provost of a Oxford College, or I'm the vice chancellor of a university. I thought, my God, there's an awful lot of vice chancellors and provosts in the House of Lords. And they kept saying, and I haven't noticed anything, which is oddly surprising, because it's the management of the universities who, of course, have the correct opinions, go along with everything that is in the orthodoxy. They haven't noticed, because they're the ones either silencing people, or they have got views which are certainly not offensive to contemporary society, go along with a lot of things. So it was fascinating but incredibly dangerous to hear the complacency with which free speech was being dismissed as one of many values at a university. Academic freedom is only one thing they need to balance against a wide range of other priorities. And so I became even more determined that I'm now going to support the bill. So there's unintended consequences of these things, because my qualms were, well, I don't trust the Conservatives on free speech. I made the point about the online safety bill coming up. I made the point about the Department of Education, Secretary of State threatening anybody who's got the wrong line on Russia, who might be rather critical of the invasion, critical of the West support for Ukraine, even though I disagree with them, and I think actually the term useful idiots might well apply. That's not the point. They have academic freedom, they're academics. So I don't trust the Tories, but I don't want to just say that because the bill is brought in by Conservative Party, I'm not going to have anything to do with it, which was another part of a kind of virtue signalling, we won't support it for that reason. And it did make me understand something as well, though, that the bill would never be sufficient. That you can't trust parliamentarians with something as precious as academic freedom, which is why I'm really delighted that this weekend, the next couple of days, I've been invited by the BOI charity to attend Living Freedom, which is a residential event for the 50, 60, 70 young people, 18 to 30, who are getting together to work out the best contemporary arguments for freedom that they can come up with. I've been asked to attend, chair a couple of sessions, and I do think that the hope for what will happen on university campuses won't be the law, won't be the legislation, and certainly won't be the House of Lords, will be the grassroots movement from students themselves, because the Higher Education Policy Institute brought out some shocking statistics this week indicating the vast majority of students actually support clampdowns on free speech, think that's their own lecturers should be sacked if they express the wrong views. And I think we need to build a resistance from below rather than a top-down legislative way of dealing with it, even if I support the law. I'm looking forward to that event because last weekend I spoke at 3 public debates that were a reminder that I feel far more at home in the public square than I do in the House of Lords. It was just a real joy to be able to talk to people from a range of backgrounds. I mean, the first one was UK and a Changing Europe, where there was a majority of people who were probably supportive of the Remain project and are very pro-EU. But nonetheless, the face-to-face life of argument and exchange is very valuable, and the other 2 events involved young people who were more interested in freedom issues. organisations that I don't have anything to do with, but I was glad to take part in their discussions. And this weekend, apart from the BOA Charities Living Freedom, I'm also going to the Bradford Literary Festival to talk about the Ukraine war, to talk about populism. And all the time that I'm in the House of Lords, and I spend hours and hours and hours in there, I'm reminded that the real life of politics has to happen outside. And the Lords themselves, and the people in the Commons, of course, the MPs, the elected bit of the Parliament, actually have to feel the public, agitating from beneath to get a sense of what is important in the world. We are going to have in the next few weeks, no doubt, big arguments about abortion. I think that that's going to come into the fore, and I'm looking forward to arguing for the essential requirement for women to have control of their reproductive rights in relation to abortion rights, in order for them to be able to be equal citizens. It's as simple as that. You have to control your own body and what happens to it. But I also am going to resist the temptation of getting hysterical about what's happening in America and imagining that you'll have to take extreme sides and, lambasting anyone who has got an anti-abortion, what they call pro-life view, and calling them alt-right. Because, again, I don't find that helpful, but I do think a useful exchange on what is important about abortion rights would be helpful. I'm not going to necessarily support Stella Creasy, who's, as an MP, trying to hijack the Bill of Rights, which apparently they all hate, but now they want to hijack. But I said I did that with the schools bill, so fair enough. But I disagree with the idea that all that you need to do is to get it into a Bill of Rights and that will guarantee it as a freedom. It seems a cop-out to me. But more of that. But a massive debate that's happening next week in the House of Lords that is likely to be the most ferocious and the most contentious that we've ever had is, guess what time the Lords should start at every day. It's the sitting times of the House of Lords debate on Tuesday, and there's more agitation about this than anything else. Some people are trying to change the House of Lords to stay earlier, rather than the 2:30 when it does start. And you listening and watching might well think 2:30, that's ridiculous. But the idea is that people of the House of Lords have got jobs, like I've got the job as director of the Academy of Ideas, and that you actually are going into the House of Lords on top of that. I don't want it to be professionalised as a lot of the Labour Party and the Lib Dems do, with a kind of almost a 9 to 5 all day. I think it should stop at 8:30 because it's terrible if you have to sit late in the House of Lords. And I think that if you do that, you actually turn it into a much more technocratic regime. But that is likely to be the row of next week. I'm quite enjoying getting stuck in myself. But talk about internal self-obsession. The fact that anyone thinks this is something we should have a row about. But on the internal matters, I had Mike Graham, the presenter of from Talk TV, he came for lunch last week, and I was showing off the terrace, and then I was taking him through to the Commons part of the terrace so that I could have a cigarette, basically, because you're not allowed to smoke on the terrace of the House of Lords. And I got stopped by a security guard who said, no, there's been a pronouncement from the Speaker of the House of Lords that no one from the House of Commons, that no one from the House of Lords is to come onto the terrace. And it was really embarrassing because it was with Mike Graham showing off, and then I kind of turned away. Luckily the security guard said, but if you have a fag there, I'll turn a blind eye. So I kind of stood surreptitiously smoking. But I was outraged at this, and I said, is anyone else mad? He said, yeah, it was just announced yesterday, nobody knew. Anyway, showing round another person, a sixth former, Frank Hudson, who I was showing around the other day. I thought, well, at least show him the Commons terrace, but I rather tentatively said, I know I'm not allowed to bring him in. And another security guard said, oh yeah, they've changed the rules again. You are allowed to bring him in now, because apparently there was a fuss and Lords are allowed to bring their guests onto the House of Commons terrace, and then added, however, no staff from the House of Lords are allowed to go on the terrace. Now, in view of the fact I sit in the House of Lords and everybody goes on and on and on about how much they support the workers and the oppressed and all the rest of it, how it's disgraceful that there's one rule for them and one rule for us, I cannot believe there has been a rule that has banned the staff of the House of Lords from going on the Commons terrace, and that the House of Lords are not up in arms about that. So I intend to fight for the workers, raise it as often as I can, and ensure that they too are allowed to go on the Commons terrace, or if they're not allowed, that the House of Lords, lords and ladies, barons and baronesses should not be allowed either, because it's one rule for all of us as far as I'm concerned.